Welcome to the Pricing Lady podcast, where smart business owners price with purpose and profit with clarity. I'm Janine, your hostess. Today's episode is inspired by a question I get all the time, and most recently during a lecture I gave for Mass Challenge Switzerland. People often ask me, what do I do when somebody objects to my offer? Objections come in many shapes and forms. And there's not always a lot we can do to ensure they don't happen, but there's a lot that we can do to put ourselves in a situation to be able to respond to them better. Now, in my framework of what pricing is, I talk about it's how we set, how we get, and how we manage prices over time. And this topic sits squarely in how you get the price. Your price is already set, but you haven't closed the deal with the customer. That whole area is about how you communicate price, how you communicate value, how you handle pricing discussions, how you handle objections as well. Within that framework, we're going to be taking a small look at that today, and I'm going to share a couple of examples with you. We're not talking here about changing your pricing strategy necessarily, but we're going to focus on what happens before and during the conversation once that price is already set. One of the core things that you want to keep in mind is that when a customer pushes back on price, it's often about something other than just the price. So they may use the words, "that's too expensive," but they do that often because it's the easiest way to shut the conversation down. But when you start asking questions, you will often find out there's more going on behind the scenes than just the number. And that's why reaching for a discount as a reaction when somebody first objects is almost always the wrong thing to do. Let's think this through before we get into the examples. So this is what happens. You're having a conversation with the client, you've explained the offer, you've told them what the investment is, and they've either asked for a discount or objected to the price in some context, right? So the first thing that happens for you is there's a little bit of panic. Oh no, I'm going to lose the offer. It may be conscious. It may even be subconscious. And your first instinct is to drop the price. And this is the nuance of the question that I got in Mass Challenge, because they know they shouldn't be dropping the price. Or they sense that on some level at least. But that's their go-to move. And partly because they don't have any other moves to go to, right? So it feels like the easiest and simplest thing to do is to simply drop the price. And especially if you're a startup and you're trying to get early adopters, you may feel that's the only lever that you have in order to attract clients. But a price's real job is not to woo clients. Except in one very simple case. If you are trying to be the low price leader in a market, then the price is what attracts clients. But if you're trying to build a business based on the value that you deliver, then trying to use price to woo customers, it may give you a few short-term gains, but over the medium and long term, it's probably going to backfire on you. So you've reacted, oh my gosh, panic, I'm going to lose the offer. And the client may have said something just as simple as, we need to think about it. Or they may have said, that's too expensive, we don't have the budget. Or maybe they need to discuss it with someone else. These are the kinds of things that happen when someone objects. Why is it in that moment when you hear those words, those three little words like, that's too expensive, does panic set in? And there's three things going on here. First of all, there's fear. Just simple, good old-fashioned fear, either of the rejection itself or of losing the client. And when fear kicks in, we don't think very well logically anymore. That part of the brain starts to shut down to varying degrees. That's why often you get tongue-tied or you feel like you can't think of anything else except for just offering a discount. The second reason this happens is you may not even feel very certain about the prices that you have. And if you don't feel you can stand behind those prices and why you've decided that's the right price to charge, that will show up in these conversations. And often customers will feel it or sense it, and that leads to the objection. The third reason that you panic is because you're unprepared. Either you haven't done things in advance of that conversation to mitigate those circumstances, or you haven't prepared yourself for how that conversation might go and what different options you might be able to offer, or even as simple as how to respond to that pushback when it first happens. So what should you do if it's not drop the price? What should you do when an objection comes up? And the very first thing to do, and I know it sounds a little bit silly, but it's so true, is breathe. Because the first thing that happens when we panic is we don't breathe. But really breathe and then lean in and ask a question and listen. And the question could be as simple as, tell me more, or compared to what? So those are two very simple questions that you could use in that situation. It puts the onus on them to explain their stance, their response, their objection. Gives you a moment to breathe and calm down and listen. And why do you want to do this? Because it will help you to identify what's really behind that objection. If it is in the case, like we said at the beginning, that it may not be about the price, you want to know that now before you start dropping the price. Budget objections often aren't really about the budget either. It may even be about prioritizing where they spend money. And that is a different topic than just not having the money at all. But if they want to stop the conversation, it's easy to say, oh, we don't have the budget for that. These are two things that you want to do. And the ultimate goal here is to understand what's behind that objection. Most people's response is to panic and drop the price or offer the discount. I'm saying lean in, ask a question, listen, and understand what's behind it. So let's take a look at two examples. The first example is from a startup years ago. A client came to me and they wanted my approval actually to lower their prices even further. And they were already the lowest price point in the market. And during our conversation, what came out of it was that ultimately price wasn't even a topic yet from the customer's perspective. They weren't actually going to be buying anything. And my client had kept reducing the price because they knew the client was interested, or their client was interested in their offer. And they thought the objections kept having to do with the budget. What the client was saying was, we don't know what we have in terms of X, Y, Z, and until we do, we won't invest in this. But because their response was simply to drop the price, they didn't hear that message clearly. Now, the customer was actually giving them that message. They simply didn't hear it. It didn't sink in during the conversations. But if instead of responding with discounts, if instead they had asked, oh, what do you mean by that? They might have heard that message much sooner than they did. Dropping the price changed nothing, and dropping it further wasn't going to change what the customer was doing either. It might have even negatively impacted the customer's perception of what my client was offering in terms of value. They heard rejection. They didn't hear what that actual blocker was. So the conversation itself really matters. And the best objection handling doesn't start at the moment of that objection. It starts often before that. But if you get to that point where you get the objection, This is why it's so important to lean in, ask a question, and listen to what people are saying. Now, you can prepare for this in advance, and I encourage you to do so because it's a tool or a muscle that you want to utilize, but is not necessarily most people's first instinct. When you get a rejection for something, you don't go, oh, tell me more about that, right? So it's not something you're necessarily hardwired to do. So it takes effort and practice to do it and to think of that in the moment more often. Another thing that's important here is to know before you go into these conversations, what's your walk-away point? Because sometimes the most honest outcome in a sales conversation is that this simply isn't a good fit, or maybe it's not a good fit right now. So not every objection needs to be overcome, and not every prospect is worth pursuing ever or right now. And for this client, they came to me at a certain price level. They were looking to go lower. And in reality, their walk-away price was far above that original price that they gave me. Right? But they hadn't looked at it in so long that they had lost sight of that during these conversations with the client. It's important to set those standards for yourself and or for your team before you go into those conversations. Let's take a look at another example. This one comes from the sustainability sector. I often hear this from startups who are bringing out products and services and software in this sector, especially when they're using waste material to create a new product. And this came up during the Mass Challenge lecture that I gave, and they said, our customer's expectation is that because we are using waste material, their customer thinks it has to be cheaper. And they qualify that as a pricing issue. The first thing is you want to make sure that this isn't a question you're hearing once in a while, but you want to see if it's something that's consistently coming in across one segment or many segments. Because if you're just hearing it one off here or there, but it's not across the board, then you may just be dealing with a client who is special, let's say, right? And you want to be clear with yourselves and not make decisions based on one difficult client that affect your whole business. Now, second of all, in my experience, the real question here is value and value communication and the value story. And what can be difficult, especially with these sustainability products, is that you're getting waste material from one place, you're creating a product or something out of it that you're selling to someone else. Now, sometimes you're selling it to the end user. More often, people are selling it to an intermediary, somebody who is going to take that processed raw material, because it is processed raw waste material, and then they're going to do something with it. So they're comparing it to what they have already, right? And they're looking to not increase their costs, but there may be a reason for them to pay a little bit more. And that's what you want to understand, how you can leverage that, because there may be additional value in using that processed waste material. For the intermediary, there may be value, not always, but sometimes there is. And for the end user, often there's additional value. And you need to understand each of those levels of value so that you can respond to that question in the right way. When you're talking to the intermediary, you need to be talking about the value that they see and they get. And if that isn't from the processed raw material, then they very, very well not see why they should pay anymore. Doesn't mean that they shouldn't, but you need to understand the value and what it means to them. Now, maybe in some cases, the only value is that it's recycled material, and so it's not having an impact on the earth. And some intermediary type clients may well value that and some will not. And that is something that you have to be clear about in your business model. Which types of clients are you going after? Now, that doesn't mean that the ones who don't see that value couldn't be clients, but you need to leverage value in a different way than just saying, well, you're using sustainable material. So when value isn't clear, or the value that you're talking about isn't aligned with what the customer is making their decisions based upon, i.e. what they value, then of course you're going to get pushback on price. This is an opportunity for you to do things like customer interviews, understand better. How are they using that product? What is the difference if they use yours versus what they use today? What value can that add? How can you help them explain the value of the products they make with your stuff to their customer? You have to look at that whole value chain in the end. In this case, the objection was phrased as a pricing objection, but it was more a value mismatch than it was the price itself. The client was really asking the question, why do I need to pay the same or more? The startups that are in this area often don't have an answer to that question. With those two examples, it gives you two different ideas of how pricing objections or how sales objections can come into play and what you need to be thinking about. One is more about how am I answering that, and the second one is more about how am I establishing the understanding of value, and is that truly matched? Now, if you put this in the context of your own business, think about the last time you got, or even think about the last 3 pricing objections you got. Was it really about the price? Or was that your assumption? Did you go back and validate that? What was the first thing that you did when you got that objection? What follow-up question or questions could you have asked to find out what was really going on? What could you have done in advance of that conversation to be more prepared for when that moment came up? This is a biggie. And the last question I want you to reflect on is, was this or these customers worth pursuing or not? Would walking away have been a better call at this point than offering a discount or dropping the price? If you can do a little assessment of some of the recent objections that you've got, you might find some answers into some things that you can be doing differently to be able to mitigate and then navigate those discussions when they do come up. It's important to remember that pushback is absolutely normal in a business. In fact, you will probably get more of that than you get yeses over the years. And it's not a personal attack on you, your offer, or your business, even though sometimes it may feel that way. It's information that you can use going forward. And discounting is rarely the right first step when an objection comes up. Oftentimes, it's not even the answer to the actual problem that's behind the objection. So next time you hear it, get curious before you react. That's all that I have for you today. I wish you a wonderful day. Now, go get paid.